Right, folks, this is something serious here. This is Ukraine War Stories. It's made by Starny Games apparently, and as far as I know, it's been released just shortly after the war on Ukraine was started. It features scenes from various cities. We have sources here we could click on. I'll post up a link to the game in the description below so you could check it out all for yourself. Also, there's an option to support Ukraine with some funds or foundations. Just have a look for yourself, I guess. I can't really say have fun now, but you know. There we go. Oh, we can play 3 cities. Okay, so let's start with Hostomel first. Oh, I do like painting. Wow, that's... It was barely past 17, that's 5 p.m. But it was getting dark already. Spring was on its way in, but we were still getting early sunsets and cold nights. Another quiet evening in the house that was entirely too big for me and my Lilia, ever since our daughter had settled in Kiev. No surprises there. Hostomel was always too small for her. Still, she kept in touch with us. In fact, that evening I was just trying to figure out a present from her, a smartphone. Well, I wasn't trying anymore. I delegated the task to the neighbor's girl, Milena Mirzoyan. Milena is a bright girl, top of her class at the medical university in Kiev. Much younger than my own daughter Katya, barely in her 20s, quick-witted and full of life unlike me, a tired old man. I've been an aviation engineer for 40 years before retiring, and yet these modern gadgets are beyond anything I've worked with. Now my wife Lilia, she's the savvy one. That evening, she was preoccupied. "Alexei," she said in a worried voice. "Alexei, have you heard what Putin is saying? He recognized those republics in Donbass." She clutched at her chest. "Oh God, the Russians are going to invade." I looked over to see her watching a Russian broadcast on YouTube, and I could only roll my eyes. For the last few weeks, what Putin was saying was everyone's favorite gossip, that a big war was coming, that the Russians are finally going to invade in full force. That's why Milena left Kiev a day ago and came to join her parents in Hostomel. Many people fled the capital in the last few days. It was as if everybody expected Kiev to be bombed off the face of the earth. "Lily, please, nothing's gonna happen," I said, when I caught Milena's glance. She was afraid too. "Mr. Borisov, they got so many troops on our borders, they wouldn't keep him there if they would just bluff him." "That's exactly how bluff works, child. We have nothing to fear because... Now we can choose different options. Putin will try to annex Donbass at most. The right time for the attack is past. If Putin invades, the UN will eat him alive. He doesn't have nearly enough forces. Well, he probably has a lot of forces. So, hopefully, this one. Sanctions, sanctions. Last time the Russians invaded, the UN put sanctions on them. If Putin invades now, the new sanctions will do him in. I tried giving the girls a reassuring smile. In retrospect, it may have looked like a little smug. You know, at least I took first aid courses and stocked us some gauze. That'll be useful, right, darling? She looked at Milena, who replied with enthusiastic nodding. You could have done something useful as well, instead of buying more model planes. I just chuckled. I could tell she was just worried. She didn't mean it one bit. Look, if you're so worried, I'll go get the car fueled up, say, on Thursday. We weren't using our car much, except to buy groceries, so the near-empty tank didn't seem like an issue. On my bum leg, I barely left home anyway, and Lilia worked as a teacher, Carpathians, a week, no, 2 weeks, until this whole deal resolves itself, and you'll see that I was right. Stocking up on fuel is a good idea, Milena chimed in. My dad is stocking up as well before the prices rise even more. I nodded. I didn't believe war was coming. If I did, could I do anything to prevent it? But there was something I could do. Help everyone stay calm. So mood improves. First day of war. There was a deafening noise outside, wrestling me from sleep instantly. At first, I didn't believe my own ears. I thought I hadn't woken up at all, and this was all a nightmare. But then I heard a noise again. Explosions. Oh God, Lisha, they're bombing the airfield. Look, this helicopter's shooting rockets. I looked around and saw my wife. She was already running towards the window. Did she hear it first? She was always the quicker thinker between us two. After a night of sleep, stepping on my bum leg felt even worse than usual. I limped towards Lily and looked into the window. I didn't have the eyesight to make out the details, but I saw helicopters swarming over the Hostomel airfield, launching bright flares all around them. Not rockets, flares. They do it so our soldiers don't shoot them down. They're fixing to deploy the airborne troops. Lily covered her mouth with her hands and looked at me. I don't think I've ever seen her so confused and scared. Pack of things. We might have to leave town. As my wife ran around the house packing up everything of any value, I was trying to process what happened. The war had begun. I had seen it with my own eyes, but I still couldn't comprehend it. I was so convinced that the Russians would never act upon their threats. What a fool I've been. There was gunfire coming from the airfield. It snapped me back to reality. I had to do something. When I went to check up on Lily, I saw her hands were shaking. I had to calm her down, or at least make sure that she didn't forget to pack anything important. On the other hand, I never got around to refueling our car and only had enough petrol to drive to the nearest fueling station. Asked the neighbors for gasoline. Getting gasoline was my first priority. I got dressed, told Lily where I was going, and went to visit our closest neighbors. I knocked on the door, then called out a few times. Nothing. I swore silently and limped towards the next house. In about an hour I'd visited all of our neighbors. Most of them had left town, while others were packing up or waiting for their relatives to join them. They all told me to evacuate as far as possible, somewhere abroad or at least to the western part of Ukraine. The Russians weren't going to get that far, they said. Naturally, nobody had any gasoline to spare. I was heading home when someone called out my name. It was David Mirsoyan. the neighbor whose house I had visited first. He just came back home after stocking up at one of the grocery stores he owned in town. "Good day, Alexei. Have you seen our boys kick those Ruskis to the curb?" He was merry and excited. Must have been the nerves, I thought, while David kept talking. "The Russian land, the airborne left, can you imagine? Just left their troops to fend for themselves. Our boys destroyed them on the ground." I wasn't convinced. It sounded too good to be true. To snap David back to reality, I asked him about gasoline. "Of course, here you go." He got a full jerry can out of his car trunk and gave it to me. "But if I were you, I would stay put. Say the Russians who survived scattered into the woods. Personally, I'd let our boys smoke them out first." David bid me farewell and went home. To reassure his wife, who seemed to be scared, same as Lily was. And me, I believed him, and I stayed put. If I'm being honest, I just wanted to believe that it would all sort of itself out in a couple of days. I will never forgive myself for not getting Lilia out of Hostomel on that same day. "Alexei, what will we do?" Lilia complained, sniffing away the last of her tears. "Did you hear it? Did you hear how loud it was? How terrible?" I nodded and hugged Lilia closer. I sure heard it. Around 3 a.m., when we were sleeping in the basement, a shell hit our house. I don't know what it was, but it shook the whole place. I was crawling around looking for my cane, wondering if we should stay put or run, while Lilia was covering her ears and screaming. Then, when we were sure the walls weren't tumbling down on us, she started crying. This would all be over soon, I hoped, but at that time, all I could do was hold her close. The very next morning, when the fighting had quieted down, I heard a knock on our basement door. Our neighbors came to visit us. The whole Mirsoyan family, Milena and her parents. "Alexei, Lilia," David, the father of the family, walked up to me and firmly shook my hand. "How are you two doing? Are you all right? We saw your house get hit. Thank the Almighty you weren't there." "No kidding," I sighed. "We have to leave, David. This is getting too dangerous." David's wife Olga chimed in. "We can't leave, Alexei Fedorovich. We've spoken with the Territorial Defense Office. They said it's too dangerous. There's already talk about Russians shooting at cars." I wanted to curse. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sure, the war had been going on for 8 years now, but it was in Donbass, on the edge of the country. Now, the Russians were taking their planes and tanks and bombs all the way up to Kiev. I shook my head. "Tell me, did they take the Antonov airport? If they did, the road to Kiev would be wide open. We'd be seeing thousands, if not tens of thousands of men and vehicles rolling out in the next few days." No, my friend, they didn't. It's quite a story, really," David said, and motioned for his wife and daughter to carry on without him. They brought us some supplies and took him downstairs. David, meanwhile, told me the news. They had yet to make it to the TV, but the gossip had already spread around town. The Russians took the Antonov airport, but it's all shelled to bits, unusable. They won't be landing anything there or using any of our planes, I gasped. David cut himself off. He didn't need to continue. "Here too? Is it gone?" I've worked for the Antonov Design Bureau for 40 years. Aviation was my life. Still is, however little of that life is left in me. And nothing the Antonov Bureau ever made came even close to an AN-22-5 Miria, the biggest cargo plane ever designed, a marvel of engineering. Soviet, Ukrainian, it doesn't matter. Maria was a treasure. I thought it was a terrible waste that it was barely flown in our 3 decades of independence. But that day, I learned of a truly terrible waste. I felt a sting in my chest and clutched at it. David quickly rushed to support me. He helped me sit down on the ground. I couldn't talk at first, so he continued. What a rotten world, huh? I told my girl to wait out the war in Hostomel if it came, and now the war has come here. He reached into his jacket's inner pocket, and before I knew it, there was a bottle in his hand. I was appalled at first. Drinking at a time like this? But David kept talking. Nothing is sacred to those Russians. Destroying Maria is bad enough. But you know what they do to women? If the Russians get here, if they do, I can't calm my girls down and I can't protect them either. I don't even have a gun. He reached to uncork the bottle, drawing my attention to it. It was the finest Armenian cognac money could buy. Maybe let's gather everyone for a drink. Reluctantly, David agreed. It was a magnificent cognac, and Lilia found us some treats to go with it. They were usually reserved for tea time, but this time everybody drank. Even Milena, who, by her own admission, never even tried beer before. For the rest of the evening, the atmosphere had warmed up. David shared some news about the war generally going our way, and I tried telling jokes. It was a moment of normalcy in the crazy time we all found ourselves in. And finally, the girls lightened up a little. The same couldn't be said about me and David. We put on a show for the women. But we couldn't voice our worries, even to each other. The peace of mind for Olga, Lilia and Milena was a great reward to strive for. But it was completely wiped. We left the women to chat among themselves and stepped back outside. The day drew to a close, and me and David were parting ways just before the curfew. Shots were already ringing out somewhere far. The night, like the one before it, was going to get loud. Suddenly, we heard the sound of approaching vehicles. Now, what do you know? Our armed forces have finally arrived. David asked and looked out onto the road. Then his face dropped. As the armored vehicles rode down the road, we could see the bright white Z's painted on them. It has been a week since the war had begun. Just a week. An entire week. Time seemed to have slowed down, and every new day that came seemed longer than the last. Deep inside, my fear was growing. Fear for myself, my family, my home, my country. Fear for the future. We heard bombs exploding outside and wondered if the next one would hit us and if we'd survive it. This constant wait for death left us with neither energy nor willingness to do anything. All we did was keep checking the news. I don't know what we wanted to see there, as good news were in short supply. But any new information served to distract us from the horrors around us. That's what we were doing, sitting in our basement when my phone rang. Me and Lily flinched from the sound. The happy melody our daughter picked for the ringtone sounded terribly out of place. Sacrilegious, even. It was David, our neighbors. Alexei, hide your phone. The Ruskies are going around town taking them away. He hung up and I quickly hid the phone under the floorboards. David's timing was impeccable. Upstairs in the house we heard a loud crash and heavy footsteps. The Russians broke into our home. We turned off the light, leaving me and Lily in total darkness, and listened. Lasha, what would do we do? Lily whispered. I had growing panic in her voice. In the dark, I found her hand and squeezed it. Let's be quiet. Maybe they'll leave us alone. We weren't so lucky. In a few moments, someone knocked on the basement door. It was a heavy sound. They must have been knocking with a rifle's butt. Open up! Quick, we were breaking the door! I didn't want to let the Russians in, but I didn't want to antagonize armed men either. We had to turn on the lights and open the doors. 3 Russian soldiers descended into the basement. They were armed and looked ready to use their weapons at the drop of a hat. Lily backed away from them, and so did I, using the wall for support. One of the soldiers noticed my limp. What's wrong with your leg, old man? I must have thought it was a combat wound. Hurts to step on it, an old injury. Spent half my life with a cane. He nodded and looked around the basement. We're searching the houses, looking for Nazis and saboteurs. Do you know any Nazis in this city? Give him a false lead. Why not? Maybe play dumb? No. I knew he wouldn't be pleased if I told him there were never any Nazis here. But what choice did I have, anyway? I couldn't throw my neighbors under the bus. Then again, many of them had left. I'd much prefer the Russians to wreck an empty house instead of shooting someone dead. There was a suspicious man around here, but we haven't seen him for a while now. I told the soldier the address of an empty house. But the rest of us are good folk. You won't find any Nazis among them. The soldier looked at me with a squint and nodded. We'll check this information. You too. Stay put while we work. If you leave the basement, you're getting shot. When the Russians left, Lily closed the door behind them, looked at me in fear. What if they come back when they don't find anybody? I breathed out. My hands were shaking, but deep down I knew that I did the right thing. What was I supposed to do? At least this way they won't kill anybody. In reality, I wasn't sure of it at all. They were still fighting, but only on the outskirts. Lily had never gotten used to it, but I did. They were still fighting, was something I kept telling myself as I saw Russians rummage through the houses on our street. A unit of Chechens, Kadyrovites as they're called, even dropped by our wreck of a house. There wasn't much to steal, but they stole it anyway. Me and Lily had enough sense not to argue, and so they just took what they wanted and left. The Mirzoyan's turn hadn't come yet, but they knew they would not be so lucky. That's why I couldn't refuse David when he asked that his daughter stay with us a few days. Me and Lilia were just a tired old couple, and with my leg, I wasn't much of a threat. The Russians were done with us. Thank you so much, Alexei. Those people are monsters. David shared as Lily helped Milena make her way into her basement. Have you heard the word around town? Of course I had. The Russians took whatever they wanted. They ate anything that could be eaten, drank anything that could be drank, took anything they could resell back home. I wasn't born yesterday. I expected as much. It was war, and I could accept it. But what they did to women, I refused to accept. Are you sure you don't want to join us with Olga? We'll make room, I offered. He shook his head. No, Fedorovich. You just keep Milena hidden for a few days, okay? Me and Olga will manage somehow. We'll keep real quiet. He put his fingers to his lips and smiled. I smiled back at him, and as he walked out onto the street, I waved him goodbye. There was a pop, like a firecracker going off in the distance. David fell to the ground. He screamed. What I did next I could never be proud of. I threw myself towards the basement entrance and slammed the door shut. Downstairs, Lily yelped at the loud bang. My chest began to hurt and I clutched it with one hand. A second distance popped. The screaming stopped. I think I waited for hours. Milena was downstairs, covering her mouth and looking in mute horror. Looking with David's eyes. I think I waited for hours. When I finally peeked through the door, slow and careful, making no sound, there was David, all right, and two Russians, one standing over David and another rifling through his pockets. What did you do that for? The standing one asked. He sounded calm, bored even. He was a Nazi, can't you tell? I know them when I see them. The other shrugged in dark. I wasn't being serious. I could hear him grin. They laughed, then they both lit themselves a cigarette. I closed the basement door and kept it closed through the night. Milena cried for hours. Lily held her hand and did her best not to cry too. But in the morning she too joined in when she heard Olga's wailing outside. In the morning there was fighting on the outskirts again, but closer to us. Sometimes bullets whizzed through the air right above our fence. When I opened the door to the basement, Olga crawled towards us on all fours. But something had to be done about David. What do we do? I could not leave my friend like that, so I got a shovel and crawled towards David. As I dug a grave for him, I had to stop at least 24 times. The air would get too hot, the shots too loud, and the ground would shake so hard it knocked us all off our feet. In the end, it was barely a grave. David's broad Armenian shoulders barely fit in it. It seems like the earth itself refused to believe he was dead. But it had to suffice. And while it was little relief for the girls, we did David good. The dogs weren't going to get him. By the 10th day of war, our supplies were dwindling. Me and Lily always tried to manage with little excess and had very little food stocked up. Why would we? The shops nearby had everything we needed. But now there were twice as many of us. The Messians brought some of their own supplies with them, but it wasn't enough for 4 people. Someone had to go get us some supplies. Lily didn't want to let me go. There was still fighting in Hostomel. Every day we heard explosions, machine gun fire and artillery barrages. My wife even wanted to go look for supplies by herself, but I managed to talk her out of it. If anybody was going to take such a risk, it had to be me. I told her the Russians wouldn't give me a second thought. There was no use in shooting an old cripple. It would be just a waste of ammo. I wasn't a threat to them at all. I was trying to convince myself of this as much as her. Eventually, Lilia saw things my way, or pretended she did. Olga and Milena talked very little in these last few days. David's death was heavy on them. With him gone, they were on their own. I had a double responsibility now. Milena cried a lot. Looking at the dark circles under her eyes, I thought David should have taken her to someone else. Someone stronger and healthier. With the gunfire outside had quieted down, I took my cane and grabbed my old backpack. Lily, stay quiet down here and keep everyone inside. I will be back soon, I promise. I will see if there's anything useful nearby and be right back. She nodded, barely holding back her tears. After what happened to David, she feared for my life even more. Honestly, I'm not sure I can read all of this without bursting into tears. Seriously. Okay, it was quiet outside, and after the dark, damp basement, the sunlight was blinding. When mice did adjust to it, I wished they didn't. Many houses on our streets were ruined, either heavily damaged or simply gone. The intact ones had all been broken into and looted. The Russians took everything. Clothing, household appliances, tools, even children's toys. I couldn't understand what kind of a person would do that. I saw ransacked cars everywhere. Many of them were even missing their wheels. Some were short or flattened by armored vehicles. Inside one such car, I saw someone's mangled remains. I looked away in horror and disgust. The streets were also full of bodies. People in civilian clothing were strewn about among the debris like broken dolls. I had no idea why they were killed. Were they in the wrong place at the wrong time, like David? Did they draw someone's anger? I refused to believe this was all happening on the streets of my Hostomel. And yet, I still had a task to complete. I had to decide what to look for. I had a pressing need for many things, but with my leg, I would only manage a single purposeful trip. Maybe we should look for medicine?